for all the things that collect all week, many of your communications, many of your questions about the law. We've had, I feel like, a window on the legal system, particularly since the Trump administration seemed to run afoul of it so often and sort of flipped the entire justice system, the bird. We've had more cases related to Trump, but also things unrelated to Trump. Since we've had this activist court that's really been seized by the radical Christian right, in my judgment. And that's why we saw the rollback on a woman's reproductive rights and abortion rights in this country. We're seeing a lot of other stuff that I think is sort of quacking the same way. We begin to look at the law and justices in different ways. One of the people, and I would suggest to you one of the great guests in the history of KGO, is this guy, the former assistant U.S. attorney. He's with us on Thursdays at 11:05, and he's here with us now. Please welcome David Katz, everyone. Yeah. Hey there, David Katz.
Great to be with you, Mark. Tim?
There is so much going on, David, and I don't really know where you want to start. So I will turn it over to you. I mean, the censure of the Trump lawyer, this case that continues in Texas, which is very relevant to the abortion pill and its availability, even in states like California.
Well, let's start with the censure of the attorney in Colorado. Her name is Jenna Ellis. She was one of the ones who went around the country with Giuliani on this, misleading campaign to try to tell the nation and the world that Trump had won when in fact he'd lost. And she put out all of the lies that Giuliani and Sidney Powell were putting out. She actually said that there were 500,000 votes for Trump that had not been counted or were somehow not given proper weight in Arizona. She said that the voting machines changed the votes. She said all of that. Apparently, she was kind of a nobody. She wasn't someone famous like Giuliani, but she hitched her wagon to that, and I guess hoped that she could ride it to a post in the administration or to some great fame and fortune in the future. Of course, it all turned out to be nonsense, and she ended up facing bar proceedings in Colorado, Mark, where she's a member of the bar. She hired a lawyer, and certainly from a point of view of his lawyering, not her lawyering for Trump, but his lawyering for her, he seems to have done a wonderful job for her because he seems to have gotten her a very sweetheart deal, and she's gotten a public censure, which, given that the whole world knows what a terrible role she played and that she misrepresented the facts and the law in the case, she was sort of publicly censured anyway, right, by the massive negative publicity that she brought on herself. On top of that, she was fined $225, not $225,000, $225. So I would say that was some great lawyering from the point of view of her lawyer. She keeps her fame or notoriety. She keeps her big, website or, her followers. She's still a member in good standing of the bar in Colorado. And it does seem like it was a very small slap on the wrist. I think if this had happened in California, our bar would have been much tougher. And, I've had, friends, attorneys who've ended up, sideways with the bar in California. And it's a very unhappy place for them to be. There was a fellow on our floor, just a nice guy about 10 years ago. He did something no lawyer should ever do. He was short of money and he dipped into some client funds. And then when it was found out, he restored the money. Notwithstanding that, he was actually disbarred. And a lot of lawyers face very severe penalties, and the public thinks with good reason, right? With good reason. But it just seemed that she got quite a slap on the wrist and not much punishment at all. For what it's worth, she was, down the totem pole. And the more prominent lawyers on the case, Giuliani has been suspended from the bar, not given a public censure. He's been suspended from the bar, and he may yet be disbarred. Eastman, who was kind of the guru from Southern California on this idea that the vice president could just not count certain votes, that he could recognize slates, that he could send the vote back to the states to have sort of a recount or a redo. All of this stuff that was not the law, but that he claimed was the law. Eastman's in a lot of trouble, and you'll remember that a judge in Southern California, a federal judge, found when it became a matter of attorney-client privilege that Eastman was asserting as to documents with Trump that no, this was not attorney-client privilege because it was within an exception mark, which was the crime fraud exception. So a federal judge found that it was more likely than not that this Eastman, a member of the California bar, had committed a crime with Trump, and therefore there was no attorney-client privilege protection, and the documents had to be turned over, and they were indeed quite incriminating. And then finally, there's a fellow, I always forget his name, Jeffrey something, but he was the person who wanted to be the Attorney General. And, you know, we had a coup on January 6th. They had a little coup at the Department of Justice attempted where he was going to oust the people who'd replaced Barr. Barr had finally had enough. Barr had done all these things that, you know, you hold your nose, what he did with Mueller and everything else. But finally, Barr even left. A fellow named Rosen came in. Rosen had a deputy named Donahue. This fellow, who was lower down in the department, he was going to leapfrog over all of them. He was going to take power. He was going to issue a memo that said that the Justice Department was looking into a lot of fraud in the election, which was non-existent. And then you remember Trump said, just make that announcer, Jeffrey Clark, you lower down official that I'm going to vault over the others and make you the acting Attorney General. You issue the statement that there was a whole lot of fraud, and then let me and the Republican members of Congress take it from there. They would ballyhoo it to make it look like, oh my God, the Justice Department found fraud. Well, we can't let Biden take office. So all of those lawyers are in trouble. Ellis, the least trouble, but in fairness to this sort of situation, Mark, she was the furthest down. She was sort of a tag along, but she made an awful lot of statements. I mean, she had public interviews where she said there's 500,000 votes for Trump that aren't being counted in Arizona, and the machines are adding up the numbers wrong.
Yeah, boy, you've said so much, and it's interesting. In the disbarment and evaluation of who should be disbarred, it sounds to me, and you made the point quite well, that California might be a tougher audience than, for example, California. In the case of Ellis, I wonder, though, Colorado, it doesn't seem as though it will be a place where you'd be cut a lot of slack. But I also noted in your explanation that it sounds as though the bar in disbarment and what constitutes offenses that will likely result in disbarment has a lot to do with money. Like you gave the example of dipping into a client's monies to cover your own expenses, and then even if you reimburse them, it's considered. I mean, that was enough to just be disbarred. So when it comes to disbarment and this kind of thing, it sounds to me like money is a big trigger. And some of these political things that have been pursued, I mean, even though they've been pursued at pretty high levels, you know, Giuliani, David, as you know, it wasn't just that he was putting an election lie out there. He said you had to fight. Remember, he had the whole thing on the ellipse that day. He was saying you've got to go to combat, get into combat for the things you believe. The incendiary rhetoric that came out of Giuliani was pretty scary.
You know, Eastman also spoke at that rally. So I think Eastman and Giuliani and Trump, of course, I think Donald Trump Jr., who gave incendiary speeches at that rally and then, you know, headed people over to the Capitol. And, you know, Trump famously said, just walk right down Pennsylvania Avenue and I'll walk right down there with you. And then, you know, either like a coward, he went back in the White House because he wanted his followers to believe that he would lead them into battle, and he was cowardly and pusillanimous and didn't plan to do those things. Or maybe from Hutchinson's testimony, you remember her, Casey Hutchinson, she seems to say that he really was, what is Murdoch's latest expression, increasingly mad? That increasingly mad President Trump in the waning days on January 6th grabbed the steering wheel, and he really did demand to go there, and he was going to walk in there. I mean, like a real third world coup leader, and he was going to, you know, lead his troops into the Capitol and say, you know, I'm here to seize power. This election was stolen from me, and I'm here to take power. And that was maybe what Trump, you know, planned to do. Remember that testimony from the January 6th committee?
Absolutely. And look, he's the leading candidate, leads the Republican field for the 2024 election. Because we're on to Trump, I just want to ask you about what he's facing in Georgia, but more about something that's not directly about Trump per se, and more about what is being talked about in the Georgia legislature, which is a bill to remove prosecutors like the one who is building a case against the former president. Fannie Willis is, I believe, her name, right? And
Right.
as she's deciding whether to pursue these indictments after her investigation now that has gone on into former President Trump's effort to overturn the presidential election, and Georgia was a key place to do it. Uh, there is this legislation that's being talked about, a bill that would be in the Georgia legislature that would allow the legislature to remove someone like Willis, particularly if she was involved in something like this, which could be deemed a politically motivated case.
Well, Fannie Willis is a fascinating figure in her own right. She gave an interview to the New York Times where she said that her father was a member of the Black Panther Party and was an activist lawyer. And she's serving her first term. She was just elected in 2020. She has a very large staff down there. And of course, Georgia is an extremely controversial state, you know, a red state for a long time. It just went blue. It went blue by its famous 11,700 votes for Biden. That was what Trump was talking about on the recorded conversation when he called into Georgia to the Secretary of State. And he said, you know, find me 11,780 votes, which from the context clearly meant concoct them for me, because Georgia had already been counted 2 or 3 times, including a hand count, which showed that Trump had lost the state. So when he talks to the Secretary of State on like January 3rd and says, find me these votes, and he didn't know that that call was going to be recorded. It's so important that people, you know, remember that. He's going to try to, you know, wriggle his way out of it now and say, oh, well, I was just, just a little conversation, a little back and forth. I didn't really mean it. I meant find me legitimately. But the fact was that he didn't know that that conversation was going to be recorded. And now it's dynamite that it is. On top of that, he said during the conversation that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State's lawyer could both be in a lot of trouble, and implied that they could be in criminal trouble. And of course, when you're the president, a lot of people think that you have a lot of control of the attorney general. You know, Merrick Garland always wants it to appear, and I believe it's true, that Biden doesn't control him. But did I have real doubts that Sessions and Barr were controlled by Trump? Of course I had great reservations in that regard. And, it's a threat. When the president of the United States says you could be in legal trouble, you could be in criminal trouble to somebody, and you have this perception that he controls the Department of Justice, it's quite a threat. But, I've said this before on your show, and you could play this back to me when I'm proven wrong. All of us commentators risk that. I don't believe that she is going to charge Donald Trump with felonies in Georgia. First of all, you know, this special grand jury that she had, the one that the forewoman came forward and made comments about, and she was allowed to do that because it's not the charging grand jury. It's like an investigatory grand jury, Mark, that has the power to subpoena witnesses so they could lock in all of these important witnesses like Giuliani, like Senator Graham. That they came back in January. We heard about some of the recommendations that they'd made in February, but they came back over 2 months ago. Now, they came back with their report. You have the report, okay? All that's left to do is to go in front of the accusatory grand jury. When I was a federal prosecutor, once you have your reports all together, you know all the facts. You don't need a long time in front of the grand jury. The reality is that you have a story, the narrative that you want to present. You know from your investigation and from the previous grand jury sessions what's happened. You go in there with your indictment, your charging document, and you charge. The fact that she hasn't charged anybody, and we now know that there were 12 people recommended for indictment, I really am starting to think that, she wants to stay in office. This looks good to her constituents, but if she really wanted to charge somebody, she should have done it already. And I don't think that Trump is going to be in the first round. I think at most he would be in a second round after she flips people. And, tick-tock, time is a wasting. If he somehow wins the presidency again, and we're talking about something that could happen 18, 20 months from now, tick tock, he'll have the same argument that a sitting president can't be charged. If he can't be charged federally, I think the Supreme Court is going to say he can't be charged in a state court either. And, she should have gotten moving with this thing already. And let me say one last thing about this, because she says that it's racist that they're even presenting this bill. I think there's, certainly they're trying to help Trump. They're presenting this bill. They're trying to chill her. But in my opinion, I don't think it's racist, and I don't think it helps to build a consensus for indicting Trump in state court in Georgia to make those kinds of claims. Because if you remember Arbery, he was the fellow who's running down the street, just jogging, and these good old boys chase him and eventually kill him. You remember that famous Arbery case? That was also in Georgia. At that time, a Democratic member of the legislature in Georgia suggested a bill just like that, because one of them was a good old boy. He'd been a sheriff. He was a friend with the prosecutor. The allegation was that the prosecutor didn't go after the good old boy because he was too close to the sheriff's office. And they thought, you know what, in a situation like that, we ought to be able to remove a prosecutor. So there is some impetus down there in Georgia already to have legislation like this. It was brought by a Democrat, not approved by the Republicans. Of course, now the Republicans are going to think it's a great idea because it's a way to chill her, and it's going to chill her. It looks like the Senate down there is going to pass it. The state legislature down there passed it. It's Governor Kemp. Remember, he's the Republican. He's the one who beat Stacey. I always forget her last name.
Abrams. Yeah.
But Abrams, right. He's the one who beat her. He's the one who defied Trump, but he's a good, solid Republican who's going to sign that bill. And yes, they're going to use that. They say for all of these, pro-criminal defense attorneys, all the so-called woke district attorneys, right? They're supposedly these woke district attorneys who aren't going after marijuana cases, who aren't going to go after these abortion restrictions that the right-wingers want them to go after. These are supposedly the DAs that they want to have an impact on. But obviously, we're all big boys and girls. We know that what they're trying to do is chill a prosecution of Trump, make her life difficult, and to chill her from charging Trump. That's what they're trying to do down there, and they're about to succeed in doing it. And I just think time's a wasting for her. If she's going to charge people, charge them, bring it on, and let what happens happen.
I mean, I've never been so convinced as I am when David Katz finishes a run like that as to the fact that Donald Trump will not be indicted. You've given it, I can see why you're a great attorney. I mean, you lay out the evidence so clearly, yet it's so weird because, frankly, for the reasons that you also detail, essentially the recording of a president asking you to, invent a way for him to win your state, the evidence seemed overwhelming. But as you say, he can wriggle, and now the more this becomes politicized and the more the clock ticks, this becomes sort of a fading hope of those who really wanted to hold Trump to account. Let me ask you a question just about this Fulton County District Attorney in this case. Now, she's elected, right? Or she is
right.
elected by the people. So when
right.
you talk about this new bill, and when we've spoken of this Georgia Republican-led state legislature that wants to hatch a bill to remove her, you're really talking about a subversion or an abrogation of the people's choice, the people's voice. They've chosen her, and now the legislature is essentially replacing her when they don't like her agenda, if the bill passes.
Two things. Yeah, two things. One, one of her outs, I think, politically, at the end of the day, when she runs for re-election and she hasn't indicted Trump, just like the New York district attorney when he runs for re-election and he hasn't indicted Trump, they're going to say, you know what, Merrick Garland didn't do this. These were both violations of federal law. They have the FBI. They have, these smart assistant U.S. attorneys like I was, and they have them by the dozens. If they didn't do it, why does the state of Georgia, why does the city of Atlanta and the city of New York City have to do these things? I mean, that's kind of a bit of the cover that I think that they'll have when they run for re-election, not having indicted Trump. On your point, it's interesting, but it is a smaller subdivision, a city, than a state. If you look at California, our attorney general has a lot of power. In fact, in the last election, the fellow who ran for attorney general, he did very poorly. He didn't get any interest. It was kind of a disaster, like so many of the statewide Republicans are who run here. But the one issue that he had was he said, remember, they don't like Gascon down here. They think, why isn't Gascon? And his point was the attorney general could have taken over these prosecutions from Gascon. And the current attorney general didn't do it, but I will do it. I will actually trump, if you want to use that word, the state elected person, and I will take over the prosecution. And, in this state, your appeal is not handled by the DA's office. A criminal appeal is handled by the state attorney general's office. So the idea that the state attorney general will exert this statewide power over a locality is not radical. We have it in California, and the fact that they're going to have it in Georgia. Now, of course, it would end up going up to the state courts if they really try to change the prosecutor's discretion. The argument always is that even the courts can't change the prosecutor's discretion. It's a discretionary thing, whether you charge somebody or not. How can anybody, even a judge, even the attorney general, come along and say, you, district attorney, have to charge this person? But the state, you look at our state here, the state attorney general can say there's a conflict of interest, and they can go charge somebody. They can go over the head of the district attorney and charge somebody. And so what they're going to have there is they're going to have a commission. It's supposed to be good government, but it'll be packed by the Republicans with Republicans who are going to try to rein her in and try to tell some of the other district attorneys down there that they have to go after marijuana cases and they have to prosecute people who, help get abortion. That's what the real political fight is going to be. But the theory, it's the bigger state unit, right? It's sort of like the federal government. I mean, the attorney general in Washington can tell a local U.S. attorney what to do. If you want to use these other comparisons, the larger political unity does have some power to tell the smaller unity. The state can tell the local DA. Even though the person is elected, they have some powers that are carved out to the state as a state, and those may supersede local powers.
That's fascinating. Really fascinating. Go ahead, Kim.
I popped in because I wanted to ask a question. I've been really frustrated about the whole Tucker Carlson sightseeing, January 6th, no big deal kind of situation. I wonder, is there any type of legal route to be taken to sue or stop this type of behavior where the government gives the footage of a national event to only one agency and it's obviously for propaganda reasons? Well, I mean, do we have any recourse as a society for that injustice?
Vote for Democrats for the House so that they don't have a 4 or 5 vote majority. Something really interesting on that, I hope that's responsive to you, Kim, is that because of the crime situation, especially in New York and the New York subways and so forth, about 3 or 4 seats changed hands from the Democrats to the Republicans. And with that kind of went the majority. With that, we got McCarthy. With that, we got McCarthy turning over these tapes. I mean, there wasn't much that the previous majority, the Democratic majority, could do. Some people said, why didn't they just send everything over to the Senate and then the Senate could not give it to the House? And I think the reality is that the game is not played that way. You know what I mean? There is these tapes. They're very long. And now that McCarthy's in control of the House and he's in control of those tapes or other copies of the tapes, he could give them to Carlson. I think Carlson ends up looking really stupid in this whole thing. I don't think people buy this. I think that the smart stations are showing McCarthy at the time, saying this was terrifying. People were getting beaten. Show McCarthy's real reaction at the time. Right. Show this is all political. Show that this is all to get Marjorie Taylor Greene's vote and Gates's vote, that he's sunk to this level of what you say, deception of the public. But one of the problems is that you have the habitual Fox viewer, and they don't watch other networks. They don't listen to what we're saying right now. They don't flip around the dial, and Fox won't even cover it, just like they won't cover the Dominion lawsuit properly. And so people don't even know. They don't know that, Tucker Carlson said, I detest Trump. And now, of course, he's going back just the other way. It's all about the money. It's all because Tucker Carlson wants to get the huge paycheck and Fox wants to make the money. They shouldn't even be called Fox News. It's Fox Entertainment with enough news to kind of suck in the habitual viewer. But what are you going to do? As my mom used to say, it's a free country.
Well, and freedom of
Yeah.
speech, I guess you could argue. And that brings me to the other question I wanted to ask you about. In Florida, there's a situation where there's a lawmaker proposing legislation to have political bloggers have to register with the government if they're receiving money for their blogs, so that, I think it kind of gets in the way of their freedom of speech, but also kind of treats them more like lobbyists than journalists.
Well, that's really interesting. We have the New York Times v. Sullivan standard, which has given a huge high bar to speakers. So people really can speak freely. They're not always hit by lawsuits. If to speak freely or to have a blog, you have to go hire an expensive lawyer. That's an enormous chill on free speech. And we protect particularly public figures. But, this thing where they allow people to sue bloggers and they argue whether they're public figures or not, I think the reality is that a willful state like Florida that really wants to give them a hard time can give them a fairly hard time because the idea that free speech gives you a right to be free from particular lawsuits, they can make your life difficult. We have this anti-SLAPP in California to try to stop people from filing lawsuits that are designed to get people to curtail their First Amendment rights. But, until we had those lawsuits and stuff like that, legislature can make it, they can help sue happy people go after people. And if sue happy people can get to sue you and make you spend a lot of money out of your pocket on a lawyer, people are chilled. They just think, you know what, it ain't worth it. And I hope that those laws don't go forward. But I think that DeSantis is really walking on very thin ice. And what he's doing with Disney and all those kinds of things, I just think that it's so short-sighted and not in the public interest. But that's what makes politics, right? Obviously, some of his Florida voters don't agree with me.
Yeah, he's a jihadist, and this is one of his jihads. And to weaponize the legislature is something that he clearly seems bent on doing. David, we're out of time. So appreciate you every week. You can find David here next week as well. The former assistant U.S. attorney, and his knowledge base is quite extraordinary. I'm always astounded. Yeah. And you've laid out some stuff, honestly, a bit depressing, that we're going to see. Probably the highest profile of the things that we've talked about is the Trump case, just because we've been living in this world of anticipation for so long. But you lay out quite cleanly why it just may be a bridge too far for these various state attorneys, and county attorneys. So, David, until next week, thank you so much.
Great to be with you. It is depressing sometimes.
Yeah, it's not always that encouraging. And hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.